most of the migrants that are coming to Russia are coming from Central Asia, which are comparatively poorer, and Russia's economy can accommodate them, it can employ them, and it can be, it's an important strategy for earning money. So migrants are coming from Central Asia to diversify their kind of family portfolio of income in some ways. And the Russian economy is accommodating them. There's plenty of jobs in the economy, in the Russian economy, for migrants to earn money, even in the context of the financial crisis. Migrants are still coming and they're still earning, and this is still a valuable strategy. So on the one hand, Russia needs these migrant workers, and in a similar vein, they are culturally compatible, right? They're culturally compatible because they have a similar Soviet experience, Russian language, these skills that make them easier to integrate into society. But at the same time, they're kind of this, migrants are a mass group of people that can be framed in different ways by different groups. So on the one hand, yeah, migrant workers are needed, they're necessary. On the other hand, they're culturally different, right? They can be seen as culturally different, and this makes people nervous. In Russia, it makes people nervous in other countries as well. In many ways, we don't really understand Russian xenophobia very well at all. There's a discourse that Russia is xenophobic. And there is some evidence that people point to when they talk about Russia being xenophobic. I think, though, that there's a lot of conceptual kind of clarity that we need to pursue in order to really understand what's going on and which groups of migrants or which groups of foreigners or even which groups of minorities that Russians are really nervous about. And certainly there's work being done on this, but I think we don't really have a clear enough picture yet. I think it really varies from region to region among groups of people. So in some regions, migrants from Central Asia are seen as hard workers. They're seen as desirable because they don't drink, because they're disciplined. In other regions, they'll be seen as more kind of problematic. In the Krasnodar region, where I did some field work, I was really surprised because the region has a reputation for being very xenophobic. I was surprised to find that attitudes towards Tajiks, Uzbeks were fine. They were really quite receptive to the migrant workers that were coming from Central Asia. It was the Dagestanis that they were really complaining about. It was the Dagestanis that were the troublemakers. So I think it really ranges depending on kind of migrant intensity, depending on historical experience with minorities. So in the Urals, for example, where they have a lot of kind of multicultural, multi-ethnic traditions and experience, they are more receptive. In Moscow, what the studies have shown is that people are most xenophobic. Most people are most xenophobic in Moscow. And this is not surprising, I think, because most migrants are in Moscow. Moscow is changing. Moscow is it's a thriving, developing city. Well, of course, if people are nervous about change, they're going to be most nervous about change in a city that's intensively changing, not only in terms of economic development, but also in terms of cultural development as well. So the building of new mosques and things like this changes the face of Moscow. And so it creates these visible touch points that citizens can point to when they say, oh, migrants are coming and they're taking our jobs, they're uncivilized, they squat, they spit, they do all of these prototypically Central Asian sorts of things. I mean, these are very veiled or not very veiled references to Central Asians that people refer to when they say, well, migrants do this and migrants do that. That said, I think people in Russia don't always have a very good idea of what the word migrant means, because migrant can mean somebody coming from within the country, from a different region. Maybe they're an ethnic minority, maybe they're not an ethnic minority. And so the discourse isn't very differentiated. And then therefore, as scholars want to kind of dissect what people are thinking and how people are feeling, well, it's really difficult because people themselves don't always differentiate. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So this makes it challenging, I think, to really understand not only how people think and how people feel about migrants, but also where those impulses and sentiments have come from. I don't think that migrants are opposed to living in Russia long term. I think that what will change the situation in Russia dramatically is if the policies become so strict and so forceful that migrants really don't have any other options, that either they have to stay or they have to go. In the US case, we see that when border control was tightened, what it did is it didn't decrease migration, it made migration less flexible and less circular. And so we see that migrants now stay in the United States rather than going back and forth between here and home. And I would predict that a similar sort of phenomenon could happen in Russia if not only the laws become stricter, but the enforcement becomes stricter. Right now we have strict laws, but we don't always have strict enforcement. We have very variable enforcement that really allows migrants to kind of slip through the cracks in a number of ways. That's useful to the government because it allows migrants to continue coming in. It's useful to migrants because it allows them to go home and come back to Russia in a sort of circular pattern. The more strict that Russia becomes in terms of policy and enforcement, the more it shuts down those flexible pathways for migrants to move in. And this will either create a situation where more migrants are permanently staying in Russia, either legally or illegally, or migration sort of dries up, which I think is actually very unlikely because of the economic dynamics.